What if the only witnesses that couldn't be swayed, bribed, or manipulated were two dogs? In 2007, a 3-year-old girl vanished from her holiday apartment in Portugal. No screams. No signs of forced entry, just silence and a family engulfed in a media storm. But then two dogs entered the investigation. Not just any dogs, Eddie and Keila, trained to detect death and blood, unshakably precise and chillingly unemotional. They pointed to the unthinkable. Not outside the apartment, but inside, behind the sofa, beneath the tiles. In a rental car that came weeks after Madeleine disappeared, authorities dismissed it. The parents rejected it. But those dogs weren't guessing. They were telling us something that, to this day, remains buried under layers of denial, speculation, and silence. So, the question is, what did Eddie and Keila really find, and why did no one want to listen? My name is Harper Lane, a freelance investigative journalist with a passion for unraveling the shadows where truth often hides. For over a decade, I've covered some of the most haunting, unresolved cases in modern criminal history. But none have unsettled me quite like the disappearance of Madeleine McCann. When the case stalled in July 2007, a dramatic twist shook the investigation. Two highly trained British sniffer dogs, Eddie and Keila, were brought into the scene, introducing a new direction that challenged the dominant theory of abduction and sent ripples through both media and public opinion. Eddie, a cadaver dog, was trained to detect the scent of human decomposition, even long after a body had been removed or thoroughly cleaned. Keila, his partner, specialized in identifying even microscopic traces of human blood. Both were handled by Martin Grime, a renowned expert in crime scene canine detection with decades of experience in major investigations. Inside apartment 5A, where the McCann family had stayed, the dogs issued a total of 8 alerts. Behind the living room sofa, Eddie detected the unmistakable scent of a cadaver. Keila confirmed the presence of human blood beneath the tiles in that very same spot, despite the presence area appearing spotless. Even more disturbing, cadaver scent was also detected inside a wardrobe, a space only the family had access to, and where no death had ever been recorded. The investigation took a darker turn when Eddie and Keila alerted inside a car the McCanns had rented 24 days after Madeleine disappeared. In the trunk, Eddie again signaled cadaver scent. Keila detected blood. Subsequent forensic testing reportedly revealed a partial DNA match to Madeleine 15 out of 19 genetic markers. In many countries, that would be considered sufficient for a criminal charge. Eddie also reacted strongly to Madeleine's favorite soft toy, Cuddle Cat, suggesting it too had been in contact with a cadaver. His behavior during that alert was described by his handler as notably intense, further reinforcing the possibility that Madeleine had died, not been abducted. Despite the weight of these alerts, Kate and Jerry McCann, along with parts of the investigative team, quickly dismissed the dog's findings. Critics argue this was a critical misstep. In the true crime community, a chilling phrase began to circulate: dogs don't lie. People do. Why would two medical professionals, Madeleine's parents, reject the findings of impartial, highly trained dogs? Why were there only 2 toothbrushes in a family of 5? Why was blood found beneath freshly cleaned tiles never followed up with full forensic rigor? These lingering questions continue to haunt one of the most mysterious missing persons cases of our time. Perhaps Eddie and Keila revealed more than anyone wanted to admit. The real question may not be what happened to Madeleine, but why so many turned away from what the dogs tried to show us. Eddie sniffed, circled, then bit, and tossed the toy into the air, only reacting decisively once it had been hidden. That toy was Cuddle Cat, Madeleine McCann's beloved stuffed animal. Eddie's behavior, captured on video, was interpreted by many as evidence that the toy had been in close contact with Madeleine's body for a period of time. And it didn't end there. The final 2 alerts made by Eddie were even more unsettling. They involved clothing belonging to Kate McCann, Madeleine's mother. Eddie detected cadaver scent on one of her shirts, while the clothing of every other person involved, including other family members, elicited no response. This discovery deepened public suspicion that Kate may have come into direct contact with her daughter's body. The case gained further momentum when footage of Eddie and Keila working the scene was released to the public. In one widely viewed video, Eddie is seen barking sharply behind the EDOC living room sofa, then again at the trunk of the McCann's rental car. Meanwhile, Keela, trained to detect blood, calmly signaled the presence of blood in the same spot near the sofa. These dramatic clips quickly spread across the internet, with millions watching and concluding the dogs were exposing something the human investigation missed, or deliberately avoided. From a forensic standpoint, the evidence seemed to align. DNA samples taken from the trunk of the Renault Scenic, the car rented by the McCanns 24 days after Madeleine's disappearance, showed a 15 out of 19 genetic marker match with Madeleine. In some countries, that would be considered strong enough to secure a conviction. But experts were quick to caution the DNA results were complex, possibly degraded, and could have been contaminated. Legally, they were not definitive, but they added another ominous layer to an amicus already murky case. Still, doubts emerged about the dog's behavior, particularly Eddie's oficial portuguese. Police reports noted that Eddie initially walked past key locations, including the sofa and cuddle cat, without reacting. He only began alerting after the items were hidden or moved. His biting and tossing of the stuffed toy before alerting was flagged as highly irregular. Some experts argued this wasn't standard cadaver dog behavior, suggesting the possibility of unconscious influence from the handler, Martin Grime. Grime's reputation as one of the UK's top scent detection dog trainers was well established. With over 200 major cases behind him, his credibility carried weight. But even with a seasoned handler, scientific research has long warned of a critical vulnerability in canine forensics. Dogs are deeply attuned to their handlers' emotions, expectations, and body language. Subtle cues, often given without intention, can alter a dog's responses. This phenomenon has been documented in multiple studies and was famously illustrated on the television series America's Top Dog, where elite police dogs occasionally failed or gave false alerts when their handlers appeared nervous or under pressure. Dogs, even when perfectly trained, are not immune to human influence, especially in high-stakes, emotionally charged cases. The 17 alerts made by Eddie and Keela in the Madeleine McCann case remain some of the most talked about and controversial pieces of evidence in modern criminal investigation. To this day, they divide experts, investigators, and the public. Were the dogs revealing a buried truth, long denied, or were their signals misunderstood, perhaps shaped by the very humans who trusted them most? In the high-pressure environment surrounding the disappearance of Madeleine McCann, one of the most intensely scrutinized cases in modern history, the actions of two dogs, Eddie and Keela, became a lightning rod for controversy. But as much as their alerts fascinated the public and confounded investigators, a deeper layer of complexity emerged: the potential influence of their handler, Martin Grime. Grime, a seasoned professional with over 200 investigations behind him, was operating under extraordinary circumstances. The global spotlight, relentless media attention, and overwhelming public pressure placed every movement under a microscope. In such a charged atmosphere, even the most experienced handler can unintentionally project subtle cues, body language, vocal tone, or emotional state that influence a dog's behavior. Video footage from the searches captured moments that raised concern: minor gestures, repeated vocal tones, and delayed responses from the dogs, especially Eddie. One of the most puzzling aspects was Eddie's inconsistent pattern. In several key locations, such as behind the sofa and with Cuddle Cat, he passed over the scent multiple times before finally reacting. Unlike his typical immediate alerts in other investigations, these delayed responses struck some experts as unnatural. Critics began to question whether Eddie's behavior was truly autonomous, or if it had been unintentionally shaped by Grime's expectations or emotional state. This phenomenon isn't theoretical. Scientific studies have long demonstrated that detection dogs, even those highly trained, are deeply sensitive to their handlers' cues. Known as the Clever Hans effect in animal behavior science, it describes how animals can subconsciously respond to human signals without anyone realizing it. These concerns are echoed in real-world scenarios, such as those depicted on America's Top Dog, where trained canines sometimes gave false alerts under the stress or focus of their handlers. While skeptics argue that Eddie's irregular behavior may indicate unconscious guidance, supporters fiercely defend the legitimacy of the alerts. They point out that Eddie and Keela gave 17 distinct alerts, all tied to locations or items directly associated with the McCann family places with no documented history of death or cadaver exposure. They argue that dismissing such consistent findings based on speculation about handler influence undermines the dog's training and track record. Furthermore, they highlight Martin Grimes' long-standing credibility, asserting that his expertise lends weight to the dog's responses. The scientific foundation for cadaver dogs is, indeed, compelling. When a human body begins to decompose, it releases a specific mix of volatile organic compounds, VOCs, molecules, like putrescine, cadaverine, and dimethyl disulfide, produced through autolysis and bacterial Bagger breakdown. These VOCs are not just surface-level scents. They bind to porous materials like textiles, plastics, and upholstery, often lingering for weeks or even months, long after the body is removed. This forensic reality is crucial in the context of the Madeleine McCann case. Eddie alerted to several key areas: the back of the sofa, a wardrobe in apartment 5A, the trunk of a Renault, Scenic rented after her disappearance, and her stuffed toy, Cuddle Cat. Critics question how cadaver scent could remain without a body, but cadaver dog research across Europe and the US has confirmed that VOCs can remain traceable under the right conditions, even after extensive cleaning. Ultimately, the case of Eddie and Keela reveals a larger truth about forensic detection dogs. They are powerful tools, extraordinary in sensitivity, but not immune to human error. The Debat over handler influence versus genuine detection remains unresolved, split between those who see the dogs as silent witnesses to a hidden truth and those who fear they were led astray by subtle, unconscious signals. In a case with few concrete answers, the dogs gave us 17 alerts. The question that still echoes is not just what they detected, but who chose not to believe them. In controlled forensic studies, cadaver dogs have been able to detect scent traces on clothing that had been exposed to human remains for only moments, even after being stored for over 60 days. Environmental factors such as heat, ventilation, or cleaning may weaken these scents, but they do not erase them. In fact, enclosed, low ventilation spaces like the trunk of a car or the inside of a wardrobe tend to preserve the volatile organic compounds, VOCs, released during decomposition. That may explain how Eddie, the cadaver dog, was able to alert inside the trunk of a car rented 24 days after Madeleine McCann's disappearance. Unless he was grossly misled or manipulated, something never supported by any evidence, the most plausible explanation is the prior presence of human decomposition in that vehicle. Complementing Eddie's work was Keela, a blood detection dog trained to recognize even the faintest traces of human blood. Unlike cadaver dogs that respond to decomposition chemicals, Keela is trained to detect the molecular markers of blood, iron, amino acids, and hemoglobin components. These substances can remain chemically active and detectable even after extensive washing or attempted concealment. In fact, forensic experts have documented cases in which dogs like Keela located trace bloodstains that even luminol and UV light failed to reveal, leading to critical investigative breakthroughs. In the McCann case, Keela alerted in the same locations as Eddie, behind the living room, sofa, and inside the trunk of the McCann's rental car. This overlap was highly significant. If Eddie had detected signs of a decomposing body and Keela simultaneously detected blood, the implication becomes much harder to dismiss as coincidence. Scientific analysis has shown that even a single drop of dried blood no larger than a pinprick can remain traceable for weeks, especially when embedded in fabric or upholstery. These dogs don't rely on visible stains. They detect molecular scent signatures embedded in materials at a level invisible to the prodder, human eye. Critics rightly point out that scent detection is not infallible, and they're correct. Cadaver dog alerts alone should never be the sole basis for a conviction. But forensic science doesn't rest on absolutes. It builds on patterns, context, and converging evidence. The true power of scent detection lies in its consistency, specificity, and location relevance. Eddie and Keela issued 17 distinct alerts, all tied directly to the McCanns' personal environment, none of them random, and none disconnected from the central narrative of the case. Globally, the legal weight of cadaver dog alerts varies. In the United States, many jurisdictions recognize a dog's alert as probable cause for search warrants. In the United Kingdom, such alerts are admissible when supported by corroborating evidence. In Portugal, where this case unfolded, courts are more cautious but do not dismiss cadaver dog evidence out of hand, especially when reinforced by other findings like partial DNA matches or inconsistencies in the timeline. What gives this case compelling evidentiary weight is what forensic experts call multi-source corroboration. Cadaver alerts, blood alerts, a 15/19 DNA match in the trunk, behavior patterns, and the glaring absence of any physical evidence supporting an abduction. Individually, none of these elements prove guilt, but taken together, they form a picture that's increasingly difficult to ignore. Other high-profile cases reinforce the value of canine evidence. In the Casey Anthony trial in the U.S., a cadaver dog's alert in the trunk of a car, despite no body ever being recovered, there became a cornerstone of the prosecution's theory. In Canada's Christine Jessup case, a cadaver dog located human remains in an area previously searched and cleared by humans. Around the world, cold cases have been revived based solely on the accuracy of scent detection dogs. Skeptics often point to cases like Zapata, which Jerry McCann himself cited to discredit dog evidence. But as investigators later clarified, the Zapata case ultimately validated the dog's alert once all the facts came to light. Using such examples out of context undermines the proven scientific and investigative value these dogs provide. Viewed through the lens of forensic science, the Madeleine McCann case doesn't reveal erratic or confused canine behavior. It reveals targeted, repeated, and focused alerts, all in areas directly tied to the McCann's control. The dogs didn't wander or guess, they pointed, again and again. The question is not whether they were right, but why so many chose to look away. No alerts were made in areas frequented by strangers, hotel staff, or other guests. No other apartment was flagged. No shared or public space triggered a reaction. The dogs alerted only in places intimately linked to the McCann family, their apartment, their vehicle, their clothing, and personal possessions. While cadaver dog alerts alone don't amount to a conviction, they provide a scientifically grounded starting point. In any serious investigation, such a focus pattern would justify, not discourage, further inquiry. For seasoned investigators, a dog's alert is never the final answer. It's the beginning of a trail. In this case, that trail led straight to the McCann surroundings and has yet to be adequately explained, much less refuted. In the disappearance of a child, the actions of the parents in the critical hours and days following the event always become an important reference point, not because parents are presumed guilty, but because authentic grief is raw, often chaotic, and hard to fabricate. Discrepancies, when they arise, tend to stand out sharply in moments of emotional intensity. The first 30 days after Madeleine McCann's disappearance tell a story that is both thoroughly documented and deeply scrutinized, one marked less by unfiltered anguish and more by media strategy, public image management, and carefully curated messaging. On the night of May 3, 2007, when Madeleine was reported missing from apartment 5A at the Pueblo Ocean Club Resort in Praia da Luz, Portugal, the McCanns and their friends began searching not for forensic clues but for explanations. Within minutes, they contacted not only the police, but the British consulate and members of the press. While involving the media isn't uncommon, what stood out was how swiftly professional PR tactics were deployed. By May 4, just one day later, Kate and Jerry McCann had already framed the incident as a confirmed abduction. Despite no signs of forced entry, no fingerprints on the shutters, and no witnesses to a break-in, their interviews didn't express uncertainty or open-ended appeals. Instead, their language was confident, definitive. She was taken. This early certainty would become a defining trait of their public narrative, calm, composed, and unwavering. By the fifth day, the McCanns hired a public relations consultant, Justine McGuinness Best, known for her political communications background, not child recovery or crisis management. The PR approach intensified, focusing more on message control than investigative transparency. Then, within 3 weeks, the McCanns retained the services of Carter Ruck, one of the most aggressive libel law firms in the UK, typically employed by oligarchs, politicians, and celebrities seeking to shut down media criticism. For grieving parents, this raised eyebrows. At that point, no serious public accusations had been leveled against them. So why prioritize silencing skeptics over supporting the investigation? Meanwhile, troubling inconsistencies began to emerge between their public statements and private actions. Jerry McCann famously told reporters, "We will leave no stone unturned." Yet official police records revealed the couple declined lie detector tests, resisted a full timeline reconstruction, and were reluctant to cooperate with some requests made by Portuguese authorities. There were contradictions in their whereabouts too. Publicly, the McCanns stated they were staying in Portugal to aid the investigation. Privately, they took multiple trips, both within the country and abroad, just days after Madeleine's disappearance. One of the earliest visits was to Fatima, a prominent Catholic pilgrimage site. While many interpreted it as an act of faith, critics argued it served more as a tool to shape public sympathy than to move the investigation forward. Perhaps most telling was their return to the UK on the 9th of September, 2007, just days after they were formally declared arguidos, official suspects, by Portuguese police. The return was described as a necessity for emotional recovery, but the timing, paired with their refusal to undergo further questioning, only intensified public suspicion. It appeared to many as a strategic withdrawal at a moment of heightened legal risk. Even small behavioral details became points of forensic interest. Footage of Kate McCann in early interviews shows her tightly holding Madeleine's toy, Cuddle Cat, often avoiding direct eye contact. Later, after Eddie the cadaver dog flagged the toy, she reportedly washed it, move interpreted by some behavioral analysts as a conscious or unconscious attempt to cleanse an emotionally charged object. In the language of behavioral forensics, these actions are rarely random. They often suggest a protective disengagement, a distancing from emotional material that may trigger guilt, trauma, or exposure. While Kate McCann often appeared visibly emotional in interviews, her husband Jerry frequently adopted a more clinical, detached tone, speaking about Madeleine's disappearance in procedural language that struck many as oddly impersonal. This emotional flatness, especially in moments where spontaneous grief might be expected, fueled growing suspicion that what the public was witnessing was not a raw parental tragedy, but the careful execution of a public relations strategy. One of the most telling moments came during a media interview when Jerry was asked about the absence of physical evidence, no fingerprints, no DNA, no signs of a struggle. His response was startlingly dismissive. Whoever took her was very clean. The casual nature of this comment stood in stark contrast to the gravity of the situation. More importantly, it defied forensic logic. The idea of a clean abduction executed without noise, without trace evidence, without a single eyewitness in a populated resort strained not only credibility but common sense. Soon after, the McCanns launched the Find Madeleine Fund, initially presented to the public as a nonprofit cause. But later investigations revealed it was actually registered as a private, limited company, not a charity. This subtle but significant distinction gave the McCanns greater legal and financial control over the fund's usage, including hiring lawyers and PR consultants. Once again, this decision made within the first month reflected a pattern: a clear preference for narrative management over investigative openness. When viewed collectively, the McCanns' behavior during those first 30 days suggests a convergence of media orchestration, legal preparation, and emotional moderation. Forensic psychologists refer to this as preemptive innocence projection, a defensive behavior in which individuals, anticipating suspicion, construct an image of innocence so quickly and so completely that it paradoxically undermines their credibility. Genuine grief is rarely composed. It is chaotic, unpredictable, and unfiltered. What unfolded here felt less like grief and more like strategy, Overlaying this behavioral timeline with key forensic evidence reveals a deeper pattern. 17. Cadaver and blood dog alerts. A partial DNA match in the trunk of a rented car. The scent of human decomposition on Madeleine's favorite toy, Cuddle Cat. These findings form not just a forensic map, but a psychological roadmap, revealing a parallel narrative, one rooted in control, containment, and carefully crafted appearances. One of the most symbolically charged actions occurred when Kate McCann chose to wash Cuddle Cat, Madeleine's beloved toy. This act followed shortly after cadaver dog Eddie had alerted to the toy, indicating the scent of human decomposition. Until that moment, Kate had been seen consistently holding Cuddle Cat in media appearances, often clutching it tightly, using it as a stand-in for her daughter's presence. The sudden decision to clean such a deeply personal and emotionally loaded object raised red flags. Investigators and behavioral analysts found the timing deeply problematic. If Cuddle Cat represented a mother's connection to her missing child, why sanitize it, especially after it had been flagged by a scent detection dog? Critics argued that such an act could be seen less as coping and more as an attempt to erase physical evidence. In the world of behavioral forensics, actions carry weight. They are not viewed in isolation, but in context, measured against emotional logic, consistency, and timing. What the McCanns said and did during the earliest, most crucial weeks of the investigation continue to diverge in troubling ways. Not because of what we assume, but because of what they themselves revealed, intentionally or not. While there is no law forbidding it, and grief manifests differently for everyone, Kate McCann's decision to wash Cuddle Cat, Madeleine's favorite toy, remains one of the most symbolically charged moments in the case. The timing raised immediate questions. The act occurred shortly after cadaver dog Eddie had signaled the presence of human decomposition on the toy. To many, Cuddle Cat wasn't just a stuffed animal. It was an emotional lifeline, something Kate had clutched during interviews as a surrogate for her missing child. The choice to cleanse such an emotionally significant item so soon after a forensic alert was seen, by some not as a coping mechanism, but as a possible attempt to erase evidence. Jerry McCann, meanwhile, exhibited other behaviors that fueled public concern, especially in how he responded to the canine evidence. At one point, he referenced the Zapata case, suggesting it as an example of a false alert made by cadaver dogs. However, this claim was factually inaccurate. In reality, the suspect in that case eventually confessed, and the dog's alert was confirmed as valid. Forensic experts viewed Jerry's use of a misleading precedent as a red flag, an effort to undermine the dog's credibility not by challenging their methodology, but by invoking a false narrative. Whether this was a genuine misunderstanding or a calculated deflection remains debatable. But what it accomplished was clear. It didn't create doubt about the dogs. It cast doubt on Jerry himself. Another widely criticized moment came when Jerry, asked about the dog's alerts, responded sarcastically, "Why don't you just ask the dogs?" In a case defined by tension and grief, and under intense public scrutiny, such a flippant remark felt jarringly out of place. While sarcasm under stress isn't inherently suspicious, in this context it was perceived as dismissive, defensive, and out of step with the seriousness of the investigation. To many observers, it wasn't just a poor choice of words, it was part of a larger pattern of minimizing or resisting inconfortable questions. Perhaps the most glaring act of non-cooperation was Kate McCann's refusal to answer 48 specific questions during her formal police interview. These weren't trivial queries. They concerned the events of the night Madeleine disappeared, the layout of the apartment, and her interactions with friends. Legally, Kate had the right to remain silent. But in the psychological landscape of an investigation, especially one involving a missing child refusal to engage, often signals avoidance. Investigators interpreted this silence not as a protective legal strategy, but potentially as an indicator of deeper knowledge being withheld. Adding to the cloud of suspicion were reports from neighbors at the Ocean Club Resort, who noted that the trunk of the McCann's rental car, acquired 24 days after Madeleine vanished, was frequently left open at night. While unusual on its own, this detail became more significant when both Eddie and Keela signaled alerts in the trunk, detecting scents of cadaver and human blood, respectively. Forensic analysts suggested that the open trunk might represent an attempt to air out or dissipate lingering odors associated with decomposition. The family never provided a clear explanation for this behavior, and when viewed alongside a partial DNA match to Madeleine in the same trunk, suspicions deepened further. Investigators also noted subtle but telling discrepancies in the layout of apartment 5A between the time of the initial search and the dog-assisted forensic sweep. Most notably, the sofa, where Eddie alerted to cadaver scent, appeared to have been moved. While this could be attributed to innocent cleaning or rearranging, forensic experts saw it as a potential manipulation of the scene, particularly since the area was later identified as a hotspot for forensic interest. Individually, these actions, washing a toy, making dismissive comments, citing misleading case law, refusing to answer questions, leaving the car trunk open, and rearranging furniture, might be explained away. Some may be benign, others may reflect stress, trauma, or defensive instincts. But when viewed collectively, a pattern begins to emerge, one that deviates from expected behavior in the context of a missing child investigation. This isn't about assigning guilt through speculation. It's about acknowledging the cumulative weight of behavior, timing, and forensic context. In the disappearance of Madeleine McCann, the stark contrast between words and actions, public statements and private choices, continues to shape both public perception and the unresolved mystery at the heart of this case. In cases where direct physical evidence is limited or inconclusive, behavioral analysis becomes essential. In the disappearance of Madeleine McCann, this lens reveals more unsettling questions than definitive answers. Within criminal investigations, behavior is a form of evidence, a psychological trail that can illuminate motives, fears, or concealed truths, especially when those closest to the victim respond in ways that defy expected norms. Since the night Madeleine vanished, the behavior of her parents, Kate and Jerry McCann, has been the subject of intense scrutiny, not just by law enforcement, but by forensic psychologists, criminal profilers, and a growing true crime community. When assessed through a forensic psychological lens, their responses display consistent markers of defensiveness, strategic image control, and emotional dissonance traits that diverge sharply from the raw desperation and chaos typically observed in grieving parents. To understand this pattern, one must first grasp the concept of defensive behavior in forensic psychology. Defensiveness is not merely emotional self-protection. It often indicates an enarrayed, internal conflict between public narrative and private knowledge. In this context, Kate McCann's decision to refuse 48 questions during her police interrogation is far more than a legal right exercised. It reflects what investigators describe as strategic silence, a deliberate refusal to engage with potentially incriminating information. In cases involving missing children, an innocent parent is typically eager to provide any detail, any memory, any clue that might lead to their child. Silence, when paired with high stakes, becomes less a shield, more a signal. This silence is made more troubling when viewed alongside other behaviors that forensic psychologists categorize as preemptive concealment actions taken not in grief, but to obscure or mitigate evidence. One of the clearest examples was Kate's decision to wash Cuddle Cat, Madeleine's beloved stuffed toy, shortly after cadaver dog Eddie had alerted to it. This was not an ordinary object. Cuddle Cat had been a visible symbol of maternal attachment. Something Kate had been photographed clutching in public, embodying her emotional bond with her daughter. To cleanse it, both literally and symbolically, so soon after it was flagged by a scent detection dog raised deep concern among behavioral experts. In forensic terms, this act was not just emotionally unusual, it suggested a deliberate attempt to sanitize an item that had become forensically and psychologically dangerous. Whether consciously or not, the action aligned more with evidence management than maternal grief. Another behavioral anomaly was observed with the Renault Scenic rental car, acquired 24 days after Madeleine disappeared. Witnesses at the Ocean Club Resort reported that the car's trunk was often left open overnight. On its own, such behavior might be dismissed. But, paired with the fact that both Eddie and Keela alerted to the trunk one detecting cadaver, scent, the other human blood, and that forensic analysis found a partial DNA match to Madeleine, the implications grew harder to ignore. Forensic theorists speculated that leaving the trunk open could be an attempt to dissipate or reduce the lingering odor of decomposition. In behavioral profiling, acts that lack logical explanations but correlate with known evidence are not treated as coincidence. They are scrutinized as potential indicators of tampering or concealment. Taken individually, these behaviors could be chalked up to grief, trauma, or poor judgment. But viewed collectively, Kate's refusal to answer police questions, the washing of a flagged personal item, the peculiar handling of a rental car tied to DNA evidence, they construct a psychological profile centered on control. Not the control born from panic or pain, but the kind exercised by individuals attempting to manage a narrative, reduce exposure, and maintain composure under growing suspicion. In the absence of conclusive physical evidence, it is this pattern of behavior calculated, composed, and often counterintuitive that continues to raise serious questions. For investigators, it's not simply what was done. It's why it was done, when, and how it aligns with the evidence already on record. And in the case of Madeleine McCann, those questions remain disturbingly unresolved. This pattern of behavior aligns with a well-documented psychological phenomenon, the tendency of individuals under extreme internal stress to overcompensate by exerting excessive control over their external environment. These individuals, often referred to in forensic psychology as overcontrollers, don't typically act out with overt aggression. Instead, their methods are subtle, cleaning, reorganizing, or altering physical spaces in a way that reframes or conceals what may have taken place. In the case of Kate and Jerry McCann, the rearrangement of furniture within apartment 5A, particularly around the area where cadaver dog Eddie alerted behind the sofa, fits this pattern precisely. Police investigators noted that furniture appeared to have been moved after the initial forensic sweep, raising the possibility that someone attempted to alter the spatial narrative of the scene. In criminal investigations, altering a potential crime scene is never neutral. It often points to knowledge, or at the very least fear, of incriminating evidence. These physical inconsistencies are amplified when examined alongside verbal and emotional behaviors. One of the most telling examples is Jerry McCann's now infamous response to questions about the cadaver dog alerts. "Why don't you just ask the dogs?" Sarcastic and dismissive, this remark didn't resonate as the voice of a devastated father. It read more as a calculated deflection, an attempt to trivialize a deeply unsettling piece of evidence. In forensic psychology, sarcasm in high-stakes, high-stress situations is rarely meaningless. It often serves as a defensive mechanism, a strategy to assert control over the narrative, downplay severity, or shield oneself from emotional exposure. In this context, Jerry's quip reflects what psychologists term minimization, a deliberate attempt to dilute the impact of the evidence by treating it as absurd or irrelevant. Rather than acknowledging the possibility of a cadaver scent, he redirects attention with humor, reducing the investigative seriousness of the moment to something near ridicule. For many, this response rang not just hollow, but suspicious. Beneath these behaviors lies a deeper and more complex psychological conflict, best understood through the concept of cognitive dissonance, the mental tension that arises when an individual holds contradictory beliefs or behaviors. For instance, knowing one's involvement in a crime while simultaneously portraying an image of innocence to the world. This internal pressure often leaks through in inconsistent actions, rigid emotional control, or poorly masked attempts to sanitize the environment. When we juxtapose the McCann's carefully managed public image composed, articulate, and media savvy with the behavioral red flags logged during the investigation, we find a fractured psychological profile. This is not the raw unpredictability of trauma. This is something more strategic, the choreography of concealment. To underscore this point, one need only compare their behavior to that of other parents involved in high-profile, unresolved child disappearances. Typically, such parents exhibit spontaneous emotion, demand relentless investigation, and cling to personal items that remind them of their child. They don't sanitize emotionally significant objects like cuddle, cat after scent detection. They preserve them. They don't dismiss dog alerts. They welcome every lead. They don't avoid interviews or refuse questions. They beg for answers. In contrast, the McCanns have displayed an inverted behavioral spectrum, one more consistent with public relations strategy than the desperation of loss. And to be clear, behavioral profiling is not a declaration of guilt. It is an investigative tool, a framework for identifying anomalies, patterns, and deviations from statistically normal responses in similar scenarios. But when multiple behaviors, strategic silence, sarcasm, environmental manipulation, symbolic erasure point in the same direction, the signal becomes increasingly difficult to dismiss. These are not quirks of grief. They are behaviors layered with intention, awareness, and a visible effort to control not only the narrative, but what may one day be discovered. Perhaps the most unsettling truth is that none of these behaviors require hard evidence to raise alarm. Even in the absence of a confession, a body, or conclusive forensic proof, behavior is evidence. And in the McCann case, the behavioral trail spanning time, context, and psychological depth aligns not with transparency, but with evasion, not with cooperation, but with containment. When viewed through the lens of forensic psychology, the McCann's actions sketch a troubling portrait. From the possible erasure of forensic scent, to the refusal to participate in critical interviews, to the downplaying of evidence through sarcasm and misdirection, their behavior mirrors the psychological profiles of those more invested in protecting themselves than in uncovering the truth. If the alerts of Eddie and Keela were indeed accurate, then the implications ripple far beyond alternative suspects like Christian Bruckner. In the silent language of psychology, the McCann's behavior speaks volumes, not through their words, but through their choices. And what those choices consistently echo is not tragedy, but control. These dogs, Eddie and Keela, were not ordinary animals. Trained by one of the most experienced handlers in the UK, their alerts are not based on guesswork, theory, or suggestion. They respond exclusively to biological facts, the scent of human decomposition and the chemical signatures of human blood. And in the case of Madeleine McCann, they responded not once, but 17 times in multiple locations, every one of them closely tied to the McCann family. From the living room behind the sofa in apartment 5A, to Kate McCann's clothing, to Madeleine's cherished stuffed toy, Cuddle Cat, and finally, to the trunk of a rental car acquired weeks after her disappearance. Every alert formed a coherent forensic path, one that pointed consistently in a single direction. But not one of those alerts pointed to Christian Bruckner. Bruckner, now widely publicized as the prime suspect in the case, had no known connection to the apartment. He did not handle the toy. He did not wear the clothes. He did not rent or use the car. And crucially, he left no trace, biological or otherwise, in any of the locations where the dogs reacted. That leads to a conclusion that is not only simple, but, based on forensic principles, virtually inescapable. If Madeleine died in apartment 5A, as the dog alerts strongly indicate, then Christian Bruckner could not have been responsible. He wasn't there. He didn't touch what was touched. He didn't leave what was detected. And for dogs trained to pick up on the most minute residual sense of death and blood, that absence is not just a gap, it's a form of forensic exclusion. These dogs don't miss what's present. They simply do not react to what isn't there. In real-world criminal investigations, cadaver dog evidence does not stand alone, but neither can it be ignored. An alert from a dog doesn't come with assumptions or bias. It simply means something happened in that exact space. And their silence, in contrast, tells us who wasn't there. To maintain Bruckner as the main suspect while accepting the dog's alerts as valid is to embrace contradiction. It demands that we believe in a scenario where a man orchestrated a death in an apartment he never entered, using objects he never touched and left behind. No physical trace, all while highly trained forensic dogs somehow failed to notice him. That's not a criminal theory. That's a logical impossibility. To keep Bruckner at the center of the case, we must either reject the dog's findings outright or construct a narrative so speculative, so unsupported by evidence, that it collapses under the weight of its own improbability. It becomes a story built not on fact, but on the idea of danger. On passe crimes, on proximity. But proximity is not guilt. Being nearby is not being involved. Praia da Luz was full of tourists, workers, and transients. Christian Bruckner had a disturbing criminal history. But history is not evidence. Not in this case. And here lies the greater danger, mistaking the absence of better suspects for the presence of a guilty one. This isn't a defense of Bruckner as a person. He may very well be guilty of horrific crimes. But in this case, guilt must be rooted in verifiable facts. And the facts provided by the dogs don't just fail to implicate him, they actively exclude him. He's not on the map, Eddie, and Keela Drew. And the longer we ignore that map, the more we risk replacing investigative truth with narrative convenience. So where does that leave us? At a crossroads. If we trust the dogs, and there is no objective reason not to, then we must let their silence speak. Because in forensic work, it's not just what's present that matters, it's what's absent, what's missing, what's not there. And in this case, what's not there is Christian Bruckner. If, on the other hand, we dismiss the dog's findings, then the case reverts to an abduction theory. And in that theory, Bruckner becomes the prime suspect by default, not through evidence, but through elimination, which raises a vital question. If the dogs had never alerted, would the case against Bruckner still hold? The answer is fragile. The evidence is thin, and the narrative we've accepted may be far more about who fits the image of a villain than about who was actually there. Much of what ties Christian Bruckner to the disappearance of Madeleine McCann is, at best, circumstantial. He lived in the region. He had a troubling criminal history, including offenses against children. He owned a camper van. He received a suspicious phone call around the time Madeleine vanished. He allegedly made disturbing comments about young girls. These details form the skeleton of suspicion. But suspicion is not evidence and certainly not proof. Living near a crime scene is not the same as being at the scene. Owning a van doesn't mean it was used in a kidnapping. A phone call means nothing without content, and unsettling behavior in other cases cannot serve as confirmation in this one. Despite years of investigation across multiple countries and millions of euros spent, no forensic evidence has ever linked Bruckner to Madeleine McCann. No fingerprints, no DNA, no hair fibers, no clothing. Not a trace of Madeleine was found in any property, vehicle, or digital device connected to him. That absence of physical evidence, after so much time and scrutiny, speaks louder than speculation. Even the phone data, once held up as a breakthrough, shows only geographical proximity, not participation. And proximity in a busy tourist hub like Praia da Luz proves nothing. Then there are the so-called confessions, vague, second-hand statements, passed along by acquaintances years after the fact. One quote about knowing what happened to Madeleine was reportedly shared by someone with no recording, no witnesses, and no corroboration. In legal terms, that's hearsay, inadmissible, and unreliable. And yet, the German prosecution has continued to assert its belief in Bruckner's guilt. But belief is not evidence. And in the justice system, belief alone cannot sustain a charge. The fact that no formal charges have been brought against him in the McCann case, despite his status as an official suspect since 2020, reflects the fragility of the case. Bruckner may well be guilty of other crimes, perhaps of unspeakable things. But that does not make him guilty in this case. The danger lies in confusing a disturbing profile with a definitive connection. He may fit the role of a predator, but that doesn't mean he fits the role of Madeleine's abductor or killer. Justice is not about projecting guilt onto someone who seems capable of it. It's about establishing a clear evidentiary link to the crime. And in this case, that link has never materialized. This doesn't mean Bruckner should be dismissed entirely. His movements, contacts, and activities during the relevant period deserve scrutiny. But building a criminal case on intuition and inference, rather than on tangible, testable facts, risks undermining the very foundation of justice. Because if Bruckner isn't guilty, and we spend years convinced that he is, we give the real perpetrator time, distance, and silence. That's not just investigative failure. That's a miscarriage of truth. And at the heart of this paradox stands Eddie and Keela, the cadaver and blood detection Dogs. If we accept their alerts as accurate and there are 17 of them, then the narrative changes completely. Their alerts place death inside apartment 5A, not in some unknown location. They place it in proximity to the McCanns, their possessions, their rented car. But, crucially, they do not point to Brickner. He was never known to have entered the apartment. He never used the car. He had no contact with the items the dogs reacted to. So if the dogs are right, if Madeleine died in that apartment, then Brickner could not have been involved. He wasn't there. But if we reject the dogs, if we dismiss all 17 alerts as error, then we're left with the case against Brickner alone. And when laid bare, it becomes strikingly thin. The theory collapses under scrutiny. This is the central contradiction of the Madeleine McCann investigation. The two dominant theories, death in the apartment versus external abduction by Brickner, are fundamentally incompatible. The more weight we give to the dog alerts, the more Brickner fades from view. The more we fixate on Brickner, the more we must deny what the dogs have told us. And yet, the public narrative continues to try and hold both beliefs simultaneously, that Madeleine died in the apartment and that Brickner is to blame. But logic doesn't allow that. One cancels out the other. We cannot place a child's death inside a tightly controlled domestic environment and also claim it was the work of a stranger who never entered it. Still, the investigation persists in walking that impossible line, balancing political pressure, public demand, and the aching need for closure. But truth doesn't live in contradiction. It lives in evidence. And right now, that evidence is silent on Brickner and resonant in places far closer to home. What remains is a kind of investigative limbo space where no direction feels entirely safe, and every answer seems to raise more questions than it resolves. The McCanns, once considered suspects, are now shielded by a legal presumption of innocence, bolstered by public sympathy, institutional backing, and effective media management. Christian Brickner, long scrutinized, has yet to face formal charges in this case. And in the center of it all lies a child, Madeleine McCann, lost not only in body, but in a fog of conflicting narratives. This paradox paralyzes progress. Every time the investigation leans toward one conclusion, it risks invalidating the other. But at some point, the case must do what it has long avoided: choose a direction. Either Eddie and Keela, the cadaver and blood detection dogs, were correct, and the focus must turn inward, or they were wrong, and a real, evidence-based case against Brickner must be built from the ground up. But attempting to hold both possibilities at once is not strategy, it's confusion. The truth cannot live in two places at the same time. And until that is acknowledged, Madeleine's story remains not just unsolved, but trapped in contradiction. The case of Madeleine McCann has evolved beyond a criminal investigation. It has become a cautionary tale about how truth can be buried under the weight of competing narratives, how vital evidence can be sidelined, and how even our most advanced investigative tools are ignored when they don't fit a preferred outcome. Eddie and Keela didn't speak. They didn't theorize. They responded to biological reality, the scent of human decomposition and blood. And they responded multiple times across several locations directly linked to the McCanns. These were not speculative leads. They were among the only tangible clues in the entire case. But the follow-up was inconsistent. DNA results were inconclusive. The scenes weren't preserved. Cooperation between British and Portuguese authorities fell apart. What could have opened new investigative doors instead became a point of public debate and ultimately dismissal. Part of that dismissal stems from a real issue: the potential for human influence. Studies have shown that dogs can be unconsciously affected by their handlers through posture, tone, even subtle movements. This is why objective protocols like double-blind setups and neutral analysis are critical. But in this case, although the dogs were filmed, their findings were too easily brushed aside, not through counter-evidence, but through discomfort. And that is a dangerous precedent: to ignore forensic indicators simply because they are inconvenient. Much of the suspicion surrounding Kate and Jerry McCann didn't start with forensics. It started with behavior. Kate washed Cuddle Cat, the toy Madeleine was said to sleep with every night, just after a cadaver dog had alerted to it. She later declined to answer 48 out of 49 questions in a police interview. Jerry, when asked about the dogs, mocked the process, pointing to failed cases instead of engaging with the serious implications of their own. None of this proves guilt, but it challenges the public's understanding of innocence. When a child vanishes, parents are expected to pursue every lead, embrace every possible clue. No, a matter how unconventional. The McCanns, when it came to the dogs, did the opposite. That contradiction didn't go unnoticed, and it became fuel for public doubt. This isn't about assigning guilt. It's about recognizing that in emotionally charged cases, behavior shapes perception. It influences investigators. It determines which leads are pursued and which are dismissed. When those closest to a missing child reject potential evidence, it changes how the story is told. We also have to acknowledge our role, the public. The millions who have followed the case, discussed it, dissected it, and debated it. The rise of podcasts, documentaries, and internet forums has turned true crime into a cultural obsession. But with that power comes responsibility. Echo chambers don't lead to justice. Only facts, discipline, and the willingness to sit with discomfort can move a case forward. In this story, some believe the parents without question. Others condemn them from the parents without question. Beginning, many assume Brechner is the villain, based solely on his criminal past. But the truth won't come from who seems guilty. It will only come from evidence. Because the moment public opinion replaces due process, the truth gets buried, just like the one we're still searching for in Praia da Luz. So we arrive here, not at a resolution, but at a stalemate. If the dogs were right, then Madeleine died in the apartment and Brechner was not involved. If the dogs were wrong, then no one has been tied to the crime with hard evidence. Suspects have been named, but the evidence does not follow. Clues are there, but no one agrees what they mean. Investigators will point in different directions. Media spins different stories. And the child at the heart of it all has not come home. And maybe that's the hardest truth of all. In the pursuit of justice, consistency matters more than comfort. It's not enough to believe in someone's guilt or innocence. We must apply the same standard of proof to everyone, no matter their story, their status, or our feelings about them. Until that happens, the case will remain exactly where it is now. Not forgotten, but unresolved. Not closed, but quietly stalled. Somewhere between fact and fiction, belief and doubt, theory and truth. And in that space, the real story, the one that truly matters, is still waiting to be found.